Dave Kramer. Welcome to Roll with the Punches.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tiff. Looking forward to it.
As I said to you when you just popped on the screen, my first thing I normally tell people is how excited I am to speak to them. And whilst that is true for you, it felt like a weird, clunky butterfly in my stomach kind of thing to say.
Yeah, I think it's pretty normal and standard. I mean, this is generally what I talk about when I'm on a podcast or I'm with a community or having conversations. It's about difficult stuff. It's about challenging conversations. But what I've realized is that we've kind of, as a society, have decided what we can talk about and what we can't talk about. And some of the things we're not supposed to talk about are some of the biggest problems we're facing within our culture. So while we might have that butterfly or that discomfort, I think that's an important indicator that this is an important conversation. We need to have it to support other people in our community because, if we're not going to have the conversation, how can we make progress? So I can
100%.
appreciate the balance of the two,
Yeah.
trying to step in, but it's important.
Yeah. I A year ago today, I went on a holiday with a really good friend of mine, and we were in Vietnam. And on the bus, we were doing a cycling tour, and on the bus, she's like, "You do a lot of podcasts. Have you ever listened to the Hannah's Story podcast of Hannah Clarke?" And I went, "No, nah." She goes, "Have a listen." And I remember so vividly sitting on the bus for that trip each time we were
Mm.
on the bus, listening to that and just being, and I actually listened to it this morning from start to finish again.
Oh wow, what a morning!
It Oh, yeah, I was just like, I just wanna revisit. I just wanna hear the details again, and just like you explained then, the something so important, but so like, the details are really vivid, it's really confronting, but what happens is that shifted me, that conversation, when I first listened, and it shifted me again sitting in it today. I feel like if I listen to it in another year, it'll shift me again.
Yeah,
And I'm so proud of you for stepping up and doing what you do and talking the way that you do so honestly about being a guy in your shoes.
yeah. Thanks for saying so, and I appreciate your dedication to continuing to engage in that podcast or whatever you can to continue to shift because I think that's what it's about for everyone. I think for me, it's been 4 years of reflecting, just constantly every day rethinking, reevaluating who I am as a person, what I want to be, how I want to contribute, and how some parts of who I've been have conflicted with those outcomes I want to achieve for other people and for myself. And there's been a lot of reflecting. And I think that's the point of each podcast and each conversation is not to flip everyone over and have everyone make a complete 180, but to shift 1 degree at a time if we can, so that we're at least taking steps towards what is a safer culture for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I can appreciate how difficult it would have been just to sit in that space this morning to give yourself time to listen to it start to finish because there is some harrowing stuff in there
Big time.
within that conversation. So
Yeah, and a quite a recent guest of mine, Fiona Sanford, she spoke about having 18 years in the gymnast as a gymnast. She now goes out and speaks to teenage girls about life and consent and stuff. And one snippet that we talked about that rang in my mind as I listened to how this behavior played out and how you described it in this podcast was this 17-year-old girl learned about relationships and toxic relationships and healthy relationships and came up to Fiona at the end of this presentation and said, "I never knew that these relationships that I'm in are unhealthy. I didn't know what that looked like." And that terrifies me. It's like people need to listen to this podcast and hear the reality of what progressions, what things look like, what unhealthy relationships look like.
yeah, I think it's really important. I think most people know what it feels like, but sometimes there's this confusion around what we've associated with what a good relationship is, right? Because there can sometimes be a cycle of things happening where there is some breakdown, there's some challenges, some disagreements, some arguments, and then there's some rebuilding, and you come back to, oh, it's safe, it's secure, it's fun again, and then it breaks down again. And I think that's really normal. That's a really normal relationship that I've just described, where you have arguments and disagreements and challenges and all that sort of stuff, but you come back to safe again. What we find, I guess, when it progresses to the other end where it's not safe, is that you never actually find a way back to safety. And then it's not because you're not doing the right things. It's because this person who you're with is creating an environment that makes sure you never feel safe. Because ultimately their goal is to ensure that if you're not feeling safe, you'll always feel like you need me for that, because I'm the person who's most likely to make you feel unsafe. So you have to appease me, placate me, look out for my needs to ensure that you can keep yourself safe, when the reality is the goal should be for us as a community to shift that person's behavior, the person who's actually perpetrating the violence or the disrespect or whatever it is. That's where our focus has to be, on what that behavior looks like and how we can subtly or overtly, if we need to, challenge that behavior to support them to recognize what they're doing. Now, I'll be honest, there are lots of people who participate in disrespectful and even abusive patterns of behavior in relationships and know full well that they're doing it. There are many people who are in relationships who are doing it and are unaware, especially when we're looking at young people and we're talking to young people. More and more often, we're hearing that young people are engaging in controlling behaviors and thinking it's normal. So it's a really important place that we need to step into for having conversations with young people about what is normal and safe and what isn't. And we need to learn from them in that as well, to make sure that they're giving their feedback on what feels safe for them. Because sometimes what feels safe for them is actually contributing to unsafe. It's such a complex world. So we need to try and navigate the path together and really invite them into the conversation and work with them on that journey.
Oh, I love that. It highlights one thing I talk about a lot, and that's that idea of we mistake familiarity for safety without knowing. We respond to this feeling in our body. We don't know it or analyze it. I talk about that a lot when I say, when I put getting in the boxing ring under the microphone, I was going to say, I'm in front of the mic now, in front of the end of the microscope. It was like, why? Eventually I went, why does this environment of kind of conflict, confrontation, essentially fight or flight and isolation, why to me does that feel safe, okay? Feel like that's a weird thing. And I started looking at that and going, what's my relationship with that? And I think it's true when you look at relationships, and if somebody's background is that of turbulent interactions, then there's a familiarity, and we're not aware, we're not self-aware or aware that we're responding in that way. We're just following our emotions and the familiarity.
Yeah, I think it's following safety, right? Our brain is wired to keep us safe, and familiarity can be really safe. And so it's really for a lot of these people who are being subjected to violence and abuse in their relationships, it's how do I navigate safety in this space? And being, for many of them, aware of some of the things that they're being subjected to that are not okay. There's still a real barrier to actually getting away from it. And there's not just one, there's many barriers to getting away from it. And many of the reasons why they stay and why they are challenged in these spaces is because there's no safe way. There's no safe way out. There's no safe way past the experience they have. It's not just it's unfamiliar out there. It's that unknown could be the cost of my life. The unknown could be my children are less safe or my pets are less safe. It could be homelessness. It could be all sorts of really significant and horrifying options, right? So the choice to the question, this is why I'm always coming back to the questions that we need to ask, because we're not trying to, in the work I do, there's no, the goal is to address the problematic behavior. That's the ultimate goal. So I focus my attention on what is causing this person to feel unsafe, what is causing this person to have no options to leave or nothing around them that feels more safe than staying. Because if I focus all my attention on this person who's staying, then I'm in the wrong place. I'm blaming that person for what this person is doing. And I need to focus here on what they're doing to shift that behavior so that this person can be safe. Because if I change this person's behavior, the person who's perpetrating the violence, the disrespect, the abuse, if I can shift their mindset and shift their behavior, then that means that the people that are around them will always be safe. So I need to try. That's where my attention is always inside of this. When we're talking about domestic violence, and my story, where it comes from is recognizing that, I knew a man for 8 years. And throughout those 8 years, in the time that I knew him, I never saw what was going to happen at the end of the line. I never thought that would ever be possible, that he would murder his ex-partner and his own 3 children. I would never have seen that coming in that time that I knew him. In the 4 years since then, I've done work on understanding who he was and how I could have seen it coming. But not only that, how I, as someone who knew him and once called him a friend, how I participated in ways that supported him to maintain the belief he had that he owned Hannah and the kids. They weren't his wife and children, it was his property. And in ways and conversations that we had and interactions that we had, there were things that I did that supported him to believe that that was okay to have, that he owned them and he could do whatever he wanted with them or to them. And that's why I've shifted all of my focus away from, putting pressure on the victims in these situations to do more, and starting putting pressure on the people around the perpetrators in these situations to do more. Because it's about us as a community and what we can do to ensure that this person never, ever gets permission from us to take the steps they take towards violence. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done there to put the attention on the perpetrators of the violence, to stop what they're doing, or to address their behaviours. Whatever contributing factors they have going towards it, we need to address that too. But ultimately, we need accountability for the behaviour so it stops and changes.
I'm sure you're aware, I'm sure you've been told before, but it's so powerful to hear you just fully own up to what you just said, to say, I look back now and see how I was part of allowing that to take place. And I just, like, it gave me goosebumps everywhere, including my face. I was like, to not rub the edges off that and go, oh, in hindsight, I should have seen it. It's like, no, I see it. I see how I was part of the problem. And like, you're the man that, as I watch female, intimate partner deaths this year every time, and we are crying out for help. You're the person that we're looking for and looking to. We're looking for men like yourself to be able to open up and say, yeah, we're in it with you. Like, that's incredible. Can you share a little bit, I guess, about stepping back to the time when it was Dave, Hannah, and Rowan, and you were mates, and what did you see? Did you have moments where you thought, oh, that's crossing the line, or were you still just completely oblivious to that?
I wouldn't say I was ever oblivious. I would say that I swept it under the rug for the reasons I gave myself, for excuses I gave myself, right? And so I guess there were things that he did that I thought I was like, well, that's a bit off. No, I shouldn't have done that. But I never actually voiced it, right? So there would be times where we would, like with Han, the kids, and Baxter, we would train all together a couple of nights a week. And then on the weekends, it would be just us at their gym that they owned. And so a lot of the times we train together. If the kids weren't behaving themselves, Baxter would yell at them and do the discipline part, and then yell at Han and say, now you've got to take care of this and, clean up this mess kind of thing. Because his role as the man and the father was discipline, and her role as the woman and the mother was to care and nurture. So he would discipline them, and then she would care and nurture them so they felt okay afterwards, which is weird, right? As a father, to kind of cut yourself off from nurturing your own children and looking after your own children, to not be able to have, a calm conversation with them about sharing an iPad, rather than just jumping to 100 and telling them that they're, being bad kids and whatever when they're 3, 4, and 6 years old. And then there was, when that would happen, I would stand there and go, oh, it's a bit gross. And then I would leave it alone. I wouldn't say anything. So every now and again, I might give Hannah a bit of a look and be like, sorry, that's that kind of thing. So my dog's just joined me in the background. I apologize if there's any noise.
We love a dog.
Yeah, she's just down here somewhere. You might not see her in the blur, but you might hear her. She's just rolling on the carpet and making noise. But yeah, he would do these types of things, and I would feel uncomfortable, but I wouldn't say or really do anything apart from maybe giving Hannah a look and saying, I'm not okay with that. I hope you're okay kind of look. But it wasn't her who needed the message. I mean, she needed a message of support for sure, but he needed the accountability. He needed to recognize that you can't just treat people like that. And he would yell at her just in front of everyone, in front of classes and things like that. And people were like, oh, that's just the way he is. He's just a bit pedantic. He's a bit particular about how things need to be done. And kind of, we all just made excuses for him. We just said, oh yeah, well, he's just that type of guy. But he's also these other things, you know. He's also nice, and he's also can be really helpful with people. He'll help you move if you want to move, that type of stuff. So we kind of, rather than saying people can be both, right? People can be helpful, they can be nice, they can put on a show for other people, but they can also be abusive to their partner. We kind of say, oh, well, if they're all of these things, then they can't be that. But the reality is they can be both. And for him, he was quite clearly both. And I just never said anything about it because at the time I didn't think the ways that we held those conversations were abnormal. My whole life, I grew up in a culture that supported sexism and misogyny, right? It supported men to believe they were better than women and that we could dominate women, or that men could objectify and dehumanize and devalue women. And that was just normal in the groups that I hung out with, in the culture that I grew up with. So when I saw him do it, it didn't look any different. And that's not an excuse on my part. There were people already having this conversation. Like when you look at my work and my advocacy work, you will not see anything that I've said that a woman hasn't said before me. Everything I've said has been said by women for 100 years or more, right? Like it's not new information. It's not revolutionary. But what I wish is that, 5-10 years ago, I paid attention, right? I listened to it. And I saw that this was actually part of the problem. In fact, that I was part of the problem, not just by standing back, right? Not just by standing back and seeing that stuff happen and going, a bit uncomfortable with that, that's not okay, and saying nothing, but also by sitting around the coffee table with him and, devaluing women through sexist jokes, or objectifying women and dehumanizing women through, looking at Instagrams and CrossFit athletes and talking trash about them. Well, not really talking trash about them, but with him, he would only focus on what they looked like, not on how they performed if they're a female athlete. Didn't really like talking. He didn't like talking about the male athletes either because they were all better than him, and he had a real issue with that, people being better than him. So there was not only complicity, right? Not only me standing back, watching things happen, saying nothing, and complicitly giving him permission to continue. There was also the fact that I told the jokes that fundamentally underlie that have a truth that fundamentally underlie them around the dehumanization, devaluing, and degradation of women, and that's the truth that he upheld in his life. And you see that through the actions he took at the end of the line. So yeah, it's shit, to be honest. It sucks like to look back over 8 years of knowing someone and seeing myself in that space, knowing full well that while I am absolutely not responsible for what he did, I have to hold myself accountable for those contributions that I made that helped him believe it was okay to do what he did. Because if I don't hold that accountable space, if I don't hold myself accountable to that and look at what I can do differently to do better in the future, then ultimately, we don't change any outcomes for anyone. Because like I said, women have been doing this work for 100 years or more. They've been doing the work, right? And men have largely been like me, sitting back and saying, there are some men doing the work. Don't want to discount that. There are some men doing great work, but a lot of men are like what I was 5 years ago, sitting back and saying, it's not my problem, none of my business, it's not going to happen to me, or I'm not one of those guys. Not realizing that every single day we live, work, and play with these men. And through our conversations that devalue, degrade, and dehumanize women, we give them permission to maintain the belief. So if all we needed to do is take that out of our conversations and then hold our mates accountable to people to those contributions to those conversations, we could really shift things across our community to create a culture that is safe, not only for women, but for all people.
It's such a difficult thing to navigate. I was just thinking as you were talking about that, some of the men that I know and love, right? And that are good men, they're good people, and we love a laugh. Like I love a laugh and a derogatory joke as much as the next person. But I remember there's been times when some of these guys have said to me, on the topic of what you now can and can't say to or in front of a woman, how you can or can't behave, and how it's not fair because it's not all men. And as someone who, as a child, I was sexually abused, so there's stuff there with me and men, and I'm like, well, I'm sorry to inconvenience you with the way that you now need to behave around women you don't know, but we're looking over our shoulder our whole lives, like every one of you. Like, I'm sorry you feel inconvenienced. It's not all men, but like it's tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for opening up about that as well. certainly not easy to do anyway, let alone on a podcast. I'm sure you've spoken about it before, but that's the reality for us, right? The cost for us is giving up a joke. The cost for you is that you navigate the world in an incredibly unsafe way, wondering what's around the next corner. Because if what's around the next corner is a bloke who's been raised on sexism and misogyny and been told that all his life it's okay to belittle, to degrade, to dehumanize, and to devalue women, if he's just around that corner, you could be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
So what if the cost for me is just giving up a joke, then is that not easier than the cost of losing someone you love or contributing to violence, that's contributing to a belief system that someone might take as a sense of entitlement to use violence against women?
Yeah.
We got to weigh up those two costs.
Yeah. One of the things that hit me in the heart in that podcast today was listening to you speak when in the episode where Hannah she was taken to the hospital and she was in a really critical condition, and obviously it had gotten to the point where you had stopped having anything to do with both Rowan and Hannah, unfortunately, and you spoke and quite upset as you would be about you wanted to go to hospital but you didn't feel you could. I'd like to know, and I feel like for some men out there that might listen, that might feel like maybe they're in a space where they've failed to step up when they reflect now and could have. How did you get yourself to a space of integrating back into being involved with this, forgiving whatever was holding you back and making you feel like you couldn't be accepted? How did you navigate that feeling, emotion, and situation?
That's a long process. Some therapy was in there for sure, but I think personally the first thing was to understand what I was responsible for and to actually own it. You know, to not sit back and say, oh, but I didn't know, or but it wasn't my fault. You know, I grew up in this culture and this is just the way it was. All of that stuff can be true, but I still did the things. Right? I still told the jokes. I still objectified women. I still helped him to believe it was okay to maintain this belief that he's up here and anyone who's female is down here. You know, I still helped him believe that, right? So I had to, first of all, the first two things that I had to try and hold was I'm not responsible for what he did, but I am responsible for the permission I gave him, right? I'm not responsible for what he did, but I am responsible for the permission I gave him. And that through grief and through therapy and through all sorts of different things and it's self-work and trying to understand those two spaces and understanding how then can I make an impact and help other people in this space. That was the first part of it, is to try and weigh those two things up and be able to make those two things true. The other thing after that was to recognize that, yes, I did grow up in that culture. I was part of that, I'm still part of it. I mean, it's still here. We haven't moved on from it. But the reality for me and for many men who are alive today is that we didn't create the culture that supports violence against women and girls, but we have inherited it. We have absolutely inherited it. And the statistics show us that every single week, every year, every time they're published, we see that violence against women and girls is still a significant cultural problem that we have in our society. So it is something we have inherited. So we have to make a choice. And this was where I got to. I had to make a choice whether I believe the evidence that says that this is the sexism and the misogyny and the objectification, the devaluing and degrading women is part of what causes violence against women. If I can accept that, and accept my responsibility to that, then I can step away from that culture and I can take a couple of big steps back. In doing that though, what was important for me was to talk to the people around me and say, look, I actually don't know what's okay and what's not okay, what jokes are good, what are bad, what hurts people, what causes harm. I'm a cisgender, straight white man. I have not been impacted by the things that most vulnerable people have been impacted by, the jokes, the degradation, the dehumanization. That has not impacted me at all in my life. So I don't know what that feels like. So I had to ask the people around me, if I say something or put a foot wrong, just let me know and I'll step back away again. I need to know that. And then from there, I looked into ways to support the community. Like, how do I get out there and share with other people that it's okay to get it wrong sometimes, but we have to be willing to learn more so we can know better and then do better. It was a long process. That's a short version of everything. One other thing I guess I'll add is, like, I spent about 9 months trying to research ways to prove that theory wrong, right? This idea that a sexist culture where we see sexist language, jokes, misogyny that polices men to be tougher and harder and more, more manly men, objectification that devalues and dehumanizes women, that this culture is linked to violence against women. I wanted to prove that wrong for probably the first 9 months of recognizing that. And I did try to. I read heaps of research. I was studying psychology at the time. So I read hundreds of journal articles about violence in perpetration of violence in not only in Australia, but across cultures. And I spoke to people who'd been subjected to violence, and I spoke to people who'd used violence against others. And every time I had a conversation and every single paper I read, what I saw was evidence that this culture around sexism, misogyny absolutely contributes to violence against women. So while I sat there and said, yes, I can be, I'm not responsible for what he did, but I am responsible for the contributions I made. I had to really prove that I was responsible for the contributions I made in my own mind. And that, I think, is a step that most people can skip over. I think that for most men, we need to believe the stories of the people who've been impacted by violence. And they will tell us every single day, especially when we're talking about violence against women. You just said it before. You walk around the world afraid, what's around the next corner, what could be happening, what could happen to me if I park my car down that particular alleyway tonight and when I'm going to this event, right? Questions I don't have to ask myself. Right? If we listen to the stories of women and the experiences that they've had, then we can skip over that step of evidence and just go straight to holding ourselves accountable for the contributions we've made and say, you're right, you know what, no more. I won't do that anymore. And what I'll also do is help other people recognize the impact of that as well.
Yeah. I love, and I'm often having that conversation around fault versus responsibility. It's not my fault. Like it wasn't my fault what happened to me, but I'm the only one responsible for the outcomes now. And after reading a recent book and reflecting on some of the things just about that, about taking responsibility, I was thinking about, because children who experience what I did experience the same thing in adulthood a lot more than people who don't. So it shows that there's this behavioural change. There's something that we then don't integrate the same and react the same. I'm responsible for understanding that I have played a part in each negative experience that has come after that, by way of having the responsibility to step up and learn from it. And I don't mean it's my fault or I'm blamed for it. They're still a shitty person. But I think, the responsibility aspect for men is, women know we're making the noise, we're doing the things, but we're all in it together. I had the same conversation recently around just masculinity in general with a friend on the podcast, and it's like, it's all of us. We've all come into this world and been conditioned to the role that we're playing based on that patriarchal society that we're born into. And it's realizing what's okay, what's not. What am I letting, like, as a female that's cool with your jokes and your this and your that and putting on the bravado and being, it's like, there's these two sides of me. I stepped into the boxing ring because that was the facade of I'm strong, I'm independent, I'm bullish, which was the polar opposite of what I really was and felt. And it's understanding there's still remnants of those two parts of me, and then there's still massive vulnerabilities, and I need to be aware of them when I'm showing up as Tiff the boxer, cracking the jokes, knowing that also I'm Tiff, this fucking 7-year-old girl that's got no actual control or doesn't have the same wits about me. And that part is still moving around in the world where there are good people and bad people around me.
Yeah. And I think that's why I spend so much time talking to the rest of the community on that, because it's the responsibility. I can understand that it's not my fault. I'm responsible for how I take steps forward. But if you're continuing to take steps forward and there continues to be shitty people out there, then it may not matter what step you take. No matter what you do, you might still come across a shitty person who's going to treat you shitty or find a way to be able to do that. And that's and I shouldn't say shitty person either, because I think largely people aren't that. I think largely just branding them as something isn't going to help us change it. I think what I should say is that There are people who do shit things, and no matter where you step, you might find someone who's willing to do something terrible. And so that's why I spend a lot of time talking about, well, what do we do about that? Because I know that there are women, for example, in workplaces who may be telling sexist jokes or degrading women, but not because they want to, but because it's the safest thing to do. The safest thing to do when you're in a group of people who are making those comments is to conform to the group, because it's unsafe if you don't. And I don't just mean unsafe as in, if I call this out, people are just going to say, oh, you're a prude or you're an idiot or whatever. But they could make your job really uncomfortable. They could make when you travel in cars with particular colleagues really uncomfortable. And the onus shouldn't be on you. The person who is most impacted by the subject of that content should not be on you to challenge it. It should be on the people around who recognize they have privilege in that space, right? Me as a man in that space, if it's other men making the jokes and there's a woman there, whether there's a woman there or not doesn't really matter. But if there is a woman there, she's most likely the most vulnerable person there and least likely to say something. Not saying that she can't or that she won't, but it's the least likely, because she's the one who's most likely to be doubled down on and impacted on by the rebuttal of the jokes. So as a bloke in that space, I have some privilege there. I have an opportunity to say, fellas, come on, we can do better than that. That's not okay. Well, think about the people who are sitting in this room. We shouldn't be saying that. Actually, I might not say that one if there's only one woman there. But if there's a group, it might be a little bit better. But really thinking about the way, I was just inviting them to think about what these comments actually mean. There's a woman in the room right now and you're saying that you're devaluing and degrading them just off the cuff in regular conversation. It doesn't align, right? Or, you have a daughter, or, this person you work with, she's your good friend. Would you appreciate people talking about her like that? Those sorts of things, just to get them to start to think of those contributions. Because like I said, it's not that she can't or that she won't speak for herself or that she shouldn't speak for herself, because she can and she will sometimes, and she absolutely should if she wants to, if she feels safe to. But if that opportunity isn't there, if the safe option for her is to stay quiet or to laugh at the jokes or go along with the jokes, then that's an opportunity for me to say, you know what, we can do better than that. Let's not do that anymore.
Makes me think about that whole idea of people getting offended, and we love getting offended lately. But how do you navigate that? How do you navigate the people that are just like, it's your problem if you're offended?
Look, I just try and invite some reflection, right? Like I said, if it's a sexist comment, for example, then you can invite reflection by saying, what if someone said that about your daughter or your wife, your girlfriend, or a woman they care about, right? Because for some people, it's not a problem until it's someone they care about. And that's me, to be honest, to be perfectly honest. I didn't step into this work until I lost my best friend. I could have, for a decade before that, I could have been doing this work. But I didn't, because for me, it didn't have a personal cost. And it wasn't until I had a personal cost that I was like, I'm going to take this step and I'm going to do this work. And now it's regardless of who's involved. And I've started to broaden my perspective on human beings and how important it is to support all vulnerable people. But I mean, it took losing my best friend to do that. And I think that's for a lot of people who aren't being invited into the conversation or feeling invited into the conversation. It's trying to help them to reflect on how this is impacting on the people they care about. And one thing I often say is, if the cost of a sexist culture continuing to exist is that someone either feels entitled to use violence against a woman you care about, or that, so if the sexist culture continues to exist, someone either feels entitled to use violence, or you're contributing to the culture that supports violence against women, then what you have to consider is whether or not you value this sexist comment over the women you care about. And if you do, then fair enough. You can go make that joke. But if you value the women you love and care about more than sexism, then maybe you need to put those jokes aside. Because the reality is, again, if the cost of the joke or the comment or the degradation of human beings around you is that someone either is impacted by those comments and jokes in a way that makes them feel unsafe, or that someone feels entitled to make someone else feel unsafe off the back of the irony and the stereotypical truth that might sit beneath that joke, then what is the cost of just not telling it anymore? How much do I lose by just leaving that alone?
Think about, go.
So I was just going to say, it's not up to me to decide what offends anyone else around me. Yeah. It's up to me to recognize the impact I have on the other people around me. And if the impact I have and I want to have is positive and I intend to have a good impact on people, then sometimes that's not how it lands. it just doesn't land like that sometimes. Sometimes I tell a joke and someone says, oh, I find that offensive as someone who survived this, or as someone, as a woman, or as someone of this race or culture or whatever it is. I find that offensive. It's not up to me then to say, no, you don't. You're too sensitive and you need to harden up. That's not my job, right? I want to have a positive impact on people. My role in that space is go, oh, thanks for letting me know. I appreciate that. It's probably pretty hard to tell people that when these kinds of jokes and comments are normal. So I get it. I appreciate it. I'll take it on board. Thank you. It's not saying you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong. It's just saying I recognize that with good intentions, I wanted to be funny and it didn't land. I get it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. We're so defensive. When you reflect on the type of person, so you knew Rowan for 8 years, and when you reflect now, when you look at the evidence that was talked about again in that podcast of who he, I mean, it was premeditated, it was planned, he'd made plans in a previous relationship basically to do the same thing. So how does your perception of understanding who is a person and what sort of personality lives beneath that front that he had put on, how does that shape you and your relationships and people now?
Yeah, look, I mean, for me, every human being is different, right? And I think what happens sometimes is we try to define these particular people like Baxter who use such horrific forms of violence as monsters, or as these people who are lurking in the shadows who pop up out of nowhere. I mean, movies and media has played a big role in creating this stereotypical version of what a perpetrator of domestic violence or a rapist or someone like that might look like. But then they are anyone. There's no particular personality that we can narrow down and say this is the kind of person who does that, because they are so different. If we look at even two cases of Jared Baden Clay and Rowan Baxter, they are two completely different people. They may have had some fundamental behavioral patterns that were similar, and that's what I focus on, right? So the behavioral patterns is what we see that really cross paths. The type of person they are can really differ, like Baxter, he was very good at playing the victim. He was very good at making people feel sorry for him and feel for him. He's been so hard done by, and so when he would do things, you would make an excuse like a hard time. He's really struggling at the moment. But if someone's having a hard time and struggling, or dealing with mental health challenges or anything like that, that doesn't cause violence. It's the permission they get in and throughout their life that says, this is the choice I have to make to solve or to fix the things that I'm dealing with, regardless of what those things are. They may contribute to someone's contributions to violence, or use of violence, but they absolutely don't cause it. Mental health, drugs and alcohol, narcissistic personality disorders, all that sort of stuff don't cause it, but they are absolutely contributing factors. They do exist, and we do need to address them in a variety of different ways. But we have to hold people accountable to the behavior. We can't just excuse it. We can't say, oh, because of this, they did that. We have to say, yes, they need support. They also need accountability. We can absolutely have both. And so what I'm talking about, I guess, in terms of the behavior is like rather than focusing on this is the type of person that does that, it should be more about these are the kinds of things they will do. Were you going to say something, so?
No, I was, and then you kept talking, so I was listening.
No, that's okay.
What are some of the things, I guess the main things now when you're out speaking to people and teaching about this, trying to educate people on being better, doing better, what are the most surprising things that people just, that you would think because you work and you've researched and you've learned and you've understood, but what's the main message that's easy to drop that people are like, oh?
In terms of when they get it or when they don't get it?
Either.
Yeah, okay. I'll start with where they generally don't get it.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about domestic violence, there's a lot of victim blaming. There's a lot of, why didn't they leave, or why didn't she leave, or why would she put up with that? That's you just sound like a real asshole. I wouldn't have dated someone like that. There's no way. So there's no onus on the person who's actually perpetrating the violence. It's all on the victim. Why didn't she leave and all that sort of stuff. And the reality is, like, if we look at domestic violence and the perpetration of violence, women leave. absolutely women leave, and they're murdered, right? So when we say, why didn't she leave? The reason most often is because it might be her life, right? Han left. She was out for 11 weeks and she was murdered, right? Nikita Chola, she tried to leave and she was stabbed 35 times by her then soon to be ex-partner, and died. And Simone O'Brien, another good friend of mine, she left her partner and he came back to her place to try and talk about things. And he brought a baseball bat and hit her with the baseball bat 55 times. And she now dresses wounds for 90 minutes morning and evening to get through day to day. And to her credit, she's an incredibly courageous woman. To her credit, she says that she uses that time to be mindful and to be grateful and to practice being happy about where she's going with her life. So she's an incredibly courageous woman who shares her story quite bravely as well. And women leave, man. So asking the question, why don't they leave, is just so irrelevant. It doesn't help us. Saying, why do they put up with that? It's pretty easy to understand why someone would put up with that if their options are shitty, right? If their option is leave and be homeless, if their option is leave and not be a protector of your children, not be that safeguard between your ex-partner and your children, leave and be murdered, like these are not good options for anyone. So we need to take the attention away from that. The other thing, the flip side of that, is I can understand to some degree where that victim blaming comes from. Right, I was delivering a workshop one time, and I told the story about what happened to Hannah and the kids, and that Hannah was my best friend, and they'd been murdered on the side of a road by her ex-partner and the children's father on the 19th of February 2020. And this fella in the crowd said, "Well, it's probably all her fault. She probably brought on her fucking self." And that hit hard. I'll be honest, that hit pretty hard. I had a 4-hour workshop to run. And my goal was that guy stayed in this workshop and understood what happens inside of a relationship like that, so that he can see that this was not her fault in any way at all. So if I say to him exactly what I was thinking, which I won't say now, but if I said to him that, then I don't get him to stay in the room, right? He probably gets up and leaves. So what I tried to do is understand where he's coming from. And he's not come from the life I've come from. He was working in a construction company and had been there for about 40 years or so. I think he was about 60 odd years old. And so I recognized that in that kind of environment, he might have grown up with that kind of messaging around him, with a lot of people around him saying similar things, or the kinds of media and news that sort of funnel us down this victim blaming path. He probably consumed that his whole life, being a 60-year-old dude. And so the other thing for him is that, how do you make sense of this? How do you make sense of what Baxter did, right? And for him, and for many people like him, they want to make sense of what these people do by trying to join some dots that aren't there. They try to use a rational mind to understand an irrational, completely irrational behavior. And so they say, well, someone must have caused this. Someone must have done something to make him do that. And that's what they jump to. Well, it's probably her fault, right? Now, in no way is it true. But that's, I think, why people do it. They want to make sense of really complex and challenging and irrational things that happen. And the only way to do that for them, in what they've learned, not only throughout what our culture kind of permits and supports, but through probably messages they've received in the groups they've hung out with their whole life, is that she must have done something to cause it. So he says something like that. And my only response to people like that is, look, it's hard. I get it. We're all trying to make sense of some really horrible things in the world that we all live in. One thing I invite you to do is start to think about where people were when it came to his behavior, where people were when it came to holding him accountable, when it came to helping him, preventing him from taking the steps that he took. Because ultimately, if we put all our attention and our onus on the victims of these situations, of these relationships, then we will never solve the problem, because the problem sits with the behavior of the person who perpetrates it. So that's where we need to address it. And he ended up staying for the 4-hour workshop, which was good. I don't know where he's at the moment or where his mind went to by the workshop, but he stayed in the conversation. He was there the whole time. And that was, like we said at the beginning, the one degree of shift that I hope that he takes. And who knows what happened in the community around him. Hopefully they started to have conversations with him about particular things to help him to understand the impact of these situations on victims.
Wow. Are you familiar with Dr. Zach Seidler?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I had him on. Yeah, I had him on recently with a conversation, and I remember one of the things he commented on was that around domestic violence, which we didn't talk about a lot in any detail, but he, just that idea that men that are partaking in violent acts, even on a smaller scale, he's like, they're not even aware themselves of why. It's like they almost just get this overstimulation of whatever's going on inside their mind, and then they act it out, and they really don't have good awareness about it. It's, because I'm sure everyone like me looks at a situation like Hannah's and other people's and goes, well, like, when it's a murder suicide, what, like, you're not even here to live your life. Like, why don't you just leave yourself? Like, why? What is, like, God, if we could only step inside of the mind of the people that we're trying to figure out to shift behavior to, like, we just can't understand. How do we understand that?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge I think we can leave for other people. what we can do, because we won't be able to, we can't read minds or anything like that, but we can see behavior. So we can address behavior, and if we address enough of those behaviors, then we can challenge it to a point where it stops. And one other thing that I wanted to bring to that conversation as well around these people who jump to these conclusions, like Baxter premeditated and planned. There was no jumping to. There was he set several days for that. But for these men who use violence against women, they do have awareness, they do have self-control, and they do have the ability to not use violence when they're at the pub and a big bloke who's twice their size bumps them over and spills their drink. Right? They're able to control their violence, they're able to control their awareness. They could have had 12 beers in their account, and they're still able to go, oh, sorry, mate, no problem, and move on. But if their partner puts the wrong meal not the wrong meal, but the meal they didn't approve of on the table, that's when they shoot to violence. And that's when they say, oh, I'd had 12 beers, I didn't have any control over my behavior. I couldn't have seen it coming, it's just an outburst. When 2 hours earlier, they were able to control that outburst when they were sinking beers and they're at the pub, and it was someone who they saw that they couldn't perpetrate, that wasn't less vulnerable than them. So while we can say potentially they didn't have this awareness or they jump to these things really quickly, for a lot of them, they don't. They choose when they're going to use the violence, and they choose the most vulnerable person who they can use that violence against, someone who they have power and control and dominance over, someone who fears them, and someone who fears any options of trying to leave them as well. So it seems like it's just an outburst, but it's calculated, it's measured, it's understood, and it's chosen in those moments. So like I said, while we can't see into their minds, we can see behavior, and we probably won't see the physical acts of violence. We might see the remnants of physical acts of violence, like bruises and cuts and grazes and things like that. But what we'll most likely see are the kinds of beliefs and attitudes that support them, that support this idea that women are less than men, right? So in sexist jokes, for example, or in comments about their partner, Baxter used to say things like, she's a useless mother, or she's a terrible cook, or she's useless around the house. Those sorts of things. Like, it's just a complete degradation of who she is as a human being. She was an incredible mother. She was a great woman. She was, I don't know, I never got to taste her cooking, but she was no doubt pretty good at that too. She was pretty good at anything she ever tried. I know she wasn't too fond of cooking, but she was a wonderful woman, right? She was a great woman. And I don't think I said that enough to him, that she's a whole woman, a whole person. She's an incredible person. And maybe have a think about the kinds of things you're saying, because it's not painting a real good picture.
Would you have felt safe saying that to him?
Look,
because of
at the
how
time,
protective and he was?
This is one of the big things, right? Like, I think one of the main reasons why people don't intervene in domestic violence is because we are worried we're going to make it worse for the victim.
Yeah.
Right. One of the biggest barriers to saying or doing something at the barbecue when he makes a really derogatory comment about her is that, well, if I say something to him now, what happens when they get home, or how's he going to treat her later, or is he going to bring this up again later in the week when he wants to double down on her? And we worry about that, and that comes from a really good place. And I empathize with that. That's how I felt for the last few months of knowing them. And he made it really difficult to maintain contact with Han and the kids, because he always was saying that he was, every time I kind of spoke to her, he knew about it somehow, like through tracking Instagram and Facebook and tracking a phone, all this sort of stuff, recording devices around the place. And all we were talking about was, are you okay? Is everything all right? How's your life going? Do you need any support? That kind of stuff. And he just didn't like that. He didn't want her to have support from other people. And he
Mm.
would even say that to me, you've got to stop supporting her. That means that you don't care about me, or that means that you can't support me. And I was like, look, mate, if you make me choose, then obviously I'm not going to fucking side with you, because you're the one she doesn't care. She wants you to be happy, right? And you're trying to make her life miserable. Obviously I'm going to side with the one who wants to contribute to happiness. So ultimately I stopped talking to him, but I continued trying to talk to her until about 10 days before she passed. And then I stopped. I did let her know over a phone call earlier that month. I think it was late in January, that I might have to stop talking to at some point, because every time we do, he seems to run off with the kids or do something that makes your life even worse. So I don't want to be part of that anymore. I don't want to cause any hurt or harm.
Mm.
And I didn't do anything for 10 days, right? She sent me messages saying about CrossFit comps, and then said, I miss my friend. And I didn't reply. I didn't do anything. And then he murdered them all. Like, it's we sit back and we think we're responsible for his behavior, right? And we say, it's my fault if I hold him accountable and he doubles down on her. But it's not. The reality is, if you never hold him accountable, he will continue. He will always continue until he understands that it's not okay to continue. And if he continues in front of people and gets that complicit permission to keep going, then it's very likely it escalates. So even if you do hold him accountable at the barbecue and you say, mate, that's not okay, you shouldn't say that, and he doubles down later and he, abuses her later, he would have done that anyway. If you didn't say that, he would have done it because the traffic on the way home was shit. He would have done it because he stubbed his toe on the way in the front door. He would find an excuse to do that later, especially if we don't hold him accountable. So I think if we weigh up the two costs, would I rather make sure he knows that's not okay than give him permission to continue? Then I want to make sure he knows it's not okay.
I feels hard to ask this. It feels like I want to not ask it as much as I want to ask it, but I feel like I want the insights, and you're so open. But with everything that you've researched and learned and reflected on and done over the last 1,651 days today, is there anything you feel, and it probably wouldn't have made a difference anyway, but what actions around that time might have you done differently, if any?
Yeah, I would have stayed in her corner. I would have messaged her every day. At the very least, she would have known the day she died that I loved her. As an absolute fact, that's that's the biggest thing I would change. There's a lot of things I would have done differently throughout the course of our relationship and the conversations that I had with him. There's a very good chance that he would have tried to dismiss me out of that group of people early on, had I known what I know now and done what I do now in the conversations I have with the people around me. But I would have done everything I could to stay connected with her and with the kids, because the last thing I would ever want is for her to pass with that silence that she received from me in the last 10 days. I would much rather her have passed with, I'm sure she knew, but just a text or a call that said, I love you, I'm here for you, and I'll never go away. I'll be here every second.
And do you find connection with her now? Do you have, with all the work you're doing with her and the kids, do you find them? Do you feel them?
Yeah, I'm not an overly spiritual person, but everything I do now is motivated by Han and who she was as a person. I think that's the most important thing, is I spend so much time talking about what happened to them, talking about the 19th of February 2020, talking about all the kinds of behaviors that I saw that were problematic, that I try every time I get to have one of these conversations, talk about who Han was, because, she was, we hear the stories about her strength and her courage, but we rarely get to hear the stories, except if Sue and Lloyd are able to share their experience of her. We rarely get to hear about how funny she was, or how kind she was, or how supportive she was. Like, she was an incredibly funny person and did everything she could to make anyone laugh, and no matter when it was. And she just always wore a big smile all the time. Like, you would have no idea what she was going through because of her strength and her courage, but also because she just wanted you to be happy. Anyone who interacted with Han walked away with a smile because of who she was as a person, because she wanted to give you her smile. And yeah, I think that's the message that I want people to know. I want people to know who she really was, because she's not what happened to her, on the 19th of February 2020. And she's not what that relationship tried to define her as. She is a whole woman, a beautiful person, someone who smiled, someone who laughed, who made others laugh. And who she is continues to motivate what I do every single day.
I love what you do. I don't think I've had a conversation with anyone who has the level of courage and bravery and vulnerability in such a sensitive and personal topic. And I just want you to know how many people you mean the world to. And thank you for being so open and vulnerable in this conversation, and joining me on the show to have it.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me on. It's like I said, it'll be uncomfortable, but that's part of it. We need to have these uncomfortable conversations if we're going to shift and change this culture to one that supports the safety of all people. So I appreciate you opening up the conversation and making it happen. I genuinely do. It's as hard as it is, and I talk about this a lot, there's a tax that I pay to do the work, to be out there and having the conversations, but it's a far bigger tax that I pay when I'm sitting down at home doing nothing. So I need these conversations to take the steps that I take to move forward. So with genuine gratitude, heartfelt gratitude, I appreciate you, Tiffany. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Everyone, go and have a listen to the Hannah's Story podcast. It's a 9-episode series. It's amazing. It's graphic, so be ready for it, but it's important. And is there anywhere else you'd like to send people, Dave, to support and help and make a difference?
If you want to look into the work of Small Steps for Hannah, you can look into that. You can find me on Instagram at _Dave Kramer. There's a few links on my page to other things you can listen to and find out more about domestic violence, coercive control, and educating young people in the community. We've got the HALT program, HALT, to represent the initials of Hannah, Aaliyah, Leona, and Trey. And it's a program we're delivering in schools across the country now to support safe and respectful relationships. So, yeah. And otherwise, just reach out and let me know if you've got a story or if there's something you want to talk about. I'd be happy to sit and listen.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. Appreciate you.